What was Nate doing under the table? What's going to happen with Keely and Roy? And will Ted still be in England by the end of the season? We'll be talking about these questions and more in this video. Welcome to Square Eyes, a channel where we recap, review, and take a sideways look at your favourite TV shows. In this video, we'll be looking at episode 1 of season 3 of Ted Lasso. It's called Smells Like Mean Spirit. I'll start by recapping everything that happened in the episode, then I'll give you a few of my thoughts, pick out my favourite line, talk about some of the interesting trivia from the episode, and then look ahead to what might be coming up this season. Let's jump straight in. The season opens with a sad and bedraggled-looking Ted sat in an airport with a tiny announcement making a final call for passenger Lasso for the flight to Kansas. The iPhone Ted's holding pings a message from Michelle Lasso, Ted's ex-wife, saying, "Have a safe flight, I love you." This is all set up to make us think Ted is leaving London to go back to his wife and child in Kansas. But it's all a trick. The Lasso being called to his flight is Henry Lasso, and Ted is putting on a plane back home after he spent the summer with his dad. The phone Ted was holding was Henry's too, so Ted isn't leaving London. In fairness, I don't know how they'd have filled the 12 episodes this season if he left his job in the opening scene of the new season, but this little sequence was nicely done to play with the audience. After Ted has said goodbye to Henry, he makes a call to Dr. Sharon to talk over how he's feeling about Henry going home. Even though he's talking to his therapist, he still says he's fine, even when he clearly isn't. Eventually Ted does open up, saying he feels guilty about sending his son on a plane on his own. He also reflects on what he's doing in England still. Sharon reminds him that he doesn't quit things, but it sounds like Ted is questioning whether he should still be doing the job he's doing. It's great that Ted's still in touch with Dr. Sharon, even though she's now working with another mystery sports team somewhere else in the world. Even though the call sounds friendly, the structure of the conversation suggests that it's therapy rather than two friends chatting. After it took Ted so long to trust Dr. Sharon in the last season, I'm pleased he's still getting help from her. After the credits, we see Rebecca and Higgins looking through the papers, and Rebecca is furious that everyone in the media is predicting AFC Richmond will finish bottom of the league, including Higgins' 10-year-old son, who has a sports blog. Ted comes into the office and Rebecca tells him about the predictions, and Ted isn't bothered about the low expectations everyone has for his team. He doesn't think they're right, and is happy to ignore them. Rebecca's frustration is made even greater by the fact that Rupert's team, West Ham, are tipped to finish 4th. Then there's an interesting exchange between her and Ted, where she talks about beating Rupert, and Ted keeps correcting her and talking about West Ham. It's obvious from this conversation that Rebecca is completely focused on getting one over her ex-husband in this season. Higgins suggests they look at getting some new players, but Ted thinks the players they've got will be fine. Rebecca doesn't like Ted talking about doing fine. She reminds him of his promise to win the whole thing, which he made after the Man City defeat at the end of season 1. Rebecca tells him that she wants to see more fight from him, and Ted accepts the challenge. In the changing rooms, the players are reading the season predictions and are getting increasingly alarmed at all the pundits writing off their chances. In the coach's office, Roy Kent is now in charge of tactics since Nate left, and he's taken it back to basics, wanting to implement a simple 4-4-2 system, which the players will be familiar with and it'll keep them solid, which they'll need to be this season when they'll be the underdog in most games. Then we go to West Ham's London Stadium, where Nate is driving himself to work and he's giving off Mr. Bean vibes in his green Mini that he parks up alongside the supercars in the club car park. Nate hasn't changed much, as the first thing he does when he gets to work is check his social media. Everyone on social media seems optimistic about his appointment as West Ham head coach, and that seems to make him happy. Rebecca goes to Keely's new office, where she's now the head of her own PR company. She introduces Rebecca to her staff, who don't look anything at all like the people you'd expect to be working for Keely. They're all dressed in grey, look a bit miserable, and don't say anything when Keely introduces them to Rebecca. They just seem like an odd bunch. When they go into a private office, Keely breaks down in tears. She's so busy that she's having to schedule her emotional breakdowns. Once she lets it all out, she feels better, and they have lunch together. Over a salad, Rebecca explains how she wants to beat Rupert, and how her hatred for him has evolved and is healthier now. Now she wants to just beat him instead of destroy him. Though, to be honest, it doesn't sound all that healthy from the way she describes it. Then Keely's CFO comes in and tells Keely she can't spend £200 a week on flowers for the office. She talks to Keely with very little respect, and once she's gone we find out that she was installed by the finance company that helped Keely start the business. So it seems like Barbara is the grown-up who's been put in to make sure that Keely behaves and that the business makes a profit. I'm speculating here, but judging by the grey office drones outside and Barbara's attitude, I get the feeling that the PR business that Keely's been set up in might not have been what she was expecting. Perhaps the finance company only wanted her to front the company with her reputation and fame, and she's been used as a kind of glove puppet while the people they've installed actually run the business. I could be wrong, we'll find out over the course of the season. Nate is delivering training, and now he's the head coach rather than just an assistant. He's being even more cruel than he was at Richmond. He pulls a player out of a drill and makes him stand on the dum-dum line. He's a nasty little man sometimes. Then Nate gets called to Rupert's office. I'm guessing when he was having his office designed, he told the decorator to go for Death Star Chic, because it looks like a baddie's lair. Rupert couldn't look more like a villain if he was stroking a cat while dipping one of his enemies in a piranha tank. Rupert and Nate delight in the negative predictions for Richmond, and it's obvious that Nate loves the fact that Rupert encourages his mean streak and laughs at his nasty jokes. Rupert tells Nate that he's a killer, and Nate looks genuinely touched by the compliment. The vibe at West Ham is definitely different to at Richmond. Then we see that Nate's car is being towed away, because Rupert assumed it was one of the cleaners that parked there who had ideas above their station. Ted takes his team down into the London sewers on a field trip to make a slightly clumsy metaphor involving poo. With the new Premier League season approaching, I'd have thought working on fitness or tactics might have been a better use of the time, but I suppose the psychological aspects of the game are important too. Ted points out that London was clogged up with its own waste until the sewer system was built to take it away. Then he points out that the negativity they're carrying around with them from the press predictions is the same as the London poo, and they need to flush it out of their system. Nate attends his first press conference as West Ham manager, and despite the first question being a softball, he struggles with it and gets very nervous. Then we hear the ringing noise we usually hear before Ted has a panic attack, and Nate hides under the desk. He's trying to gather himself and avoid the panic attack. He seems to do this first by thinking of things that make him angry, like players throwing dirty clothes at him, the gift that he gave Ted that he thinks Ted didn't put anywhere, despite the fact we saw it in the background of Ted's bedroom earlier in the episode, and his father's disapproving look. Then he spits on the floor, which I think is a symbol of his disgust in himself, and that seems to calm him down. Then Nate gets a much tougher question about how he was a kit man recently, and now he's a manager, and it must be overwhelming for him. His response is vicious, basically calling the journalist stupid and moving on. It's like he's using his anger as a form of protection from his self-doubt. Being nasty to other people seems to protect him from having to face the hatred he has towards himself. When Nate gets asked about Richmond's low predicted finish, he puts the boot into them and makes some mean comments about his old club. News of what Nate said in his press conference filters back to the players and the coaches at the Earl Greyhound training ground once they're back from their sewer trip. The players get angry about their former coach bad-mouthing them in the press, but then Jamie reminds the squad about the lesson they all learned in the sewer, and it calms them down. I love how Jamie's turned from an egotistical monster to now being the sensible one that binds the team together. Then Rebecca summons Ted to her office, and she tears a strip off him for taking the team to a sewer. She's angry with him for cancelling training and taking the players to a sewer, possibly because of the training they've missed, but more likely because of the negative coverage it's had in the press and social media. She's particularly cross about how the club was made to look silly in Nate's press conference. Rebecca tells Ted that the club is being laughed at, and she asks Ted to fight back in his press conference. This just shows how rattled Rebecca is by all of this, because she should know that it's just not in Ted's nature to go out on the attack. When Ted goes into the press room, he doesn't take Rebecca's advice. He's his usual folksy self, making jokes and turning down the opportunity to be critical of Nate. In fact, he's quite complimentary of his former coach. His only criticism that he didn't go after Ted enough. Then Ted has a go at roasting himself, and soon the press are laughing along with his comedy routine. Rebecca is initially unimpressed that Ted has ignored her instruction to go out on the attack, but then she receives a text from Keeley, and that changes her perspective. She's laughing along too soon, and sees that Ted not engaging with Nate's negativity is the best response after all. It reminds me of that saying, that the best revenge is a life well lived. Ted isn't going to let bitterness consume him, he's just going to continue doing what he does. Nate's watching along in his office and slams his laptop down in frustration, so it's obvious Ted's approach was the right one. Then we see Nate scroll through social media and it's now full of positivity about Ted, which makes him even angrier. This is followed by a text coming in from his mum saying that his dad was upset that he swore during his press conference. This sounds about right for Nate and his father's relationship. He's reached the pinnacle of his career, managing a Premier League football club, and his father grumbles about his bad language rather than telling him how proud he is of him. The good news for Nate is that he has a new father figure in the form of Rupert, and he's just bought him a swanky new car to replace his little Mini. Rupert smiles down from his evil lair as Nate drives his new car out of the car park. Roy and Keeley have broken up, and they're both breaking the news to Roy's niece Phoebe. We saw their relationship was on shaky ground at the end of last season, but things obviously got worse after that. When they tell her about the breakup, it seems like they don't really have a good reason for separating. It's mostly because they're too busy, but Phoebe's right when she says they've been busy before. It's pretty devastating when Phoebe says one of her core beliefs is nothing lasts forever. I suppose she's probably not wrong, but it's a bleak worldview for a little girl to have. As they're walking home, Ted asks Beard about why they're still in London. They don't really come to a conclusion, so I get the sense that this will be a question we'll come back to over the course of this season. Either Ted will work out why he's at AFC Richmond, or he'll realise it's time to move on. Once he's home, Ted FaceTimes Henry and shows him his Lego Nelson Road Stadium. Henry points out that Nate shouldn't be off to the side, and Ted can still be friends with him even though they don't work together anymore. Ted agrees with him and puts the Nate figure next to his own little minifigure. Could this be a hint towards a future storyline? Is Nate going to be redeemed? It seems like he's gone too far towards the dark side, but I suppose Darth Vader turned back at the end of Return of the Jedi, and the creators of Ted Lasso often liken their story to Star Wars. In the final scene of the episode, Henry shows Ted his new Infinity Gauntlet, which his mum's new friend Jake bought for him. Ted's face goes through about 16 different expressions in the 2 seconds when he hears about Michelle's new friend, but no matter how much he tried to hide it from Henry, it's obviously sickened that Michelle's seeing someone else. I think there's a lot to like about this episode. For a long wait between Season 2 ending and Season 3 starting, I was nervous that the long production time could have been because they struggled to recreate the magic from the first 2 seasons, but this episode felt like a continuation of the same story with no drop-off in quality. It wasn't an amazing episode, because the opening episodes of a season rarely are, but it was enjoyable to spend more time with these characters, and the stakes of the season were nicely set up. I think if you look back on this episode at the end of the season, most of the major story threads will have been set up one way or another in this episode. For Ted, he spoke on more than one occasion about his doubt about why he was still at AFC Richmond after all this time. Alongside his sadness about packing his son back to Kansas, it makes it clear that he's being pulled back towards the United States, but they're still pulling the opposite direction for him to stay and finish the job, not to mention the fact he doesn't quit things, so he won't allow himself just to walk away from his team. I think Ted's doubts that he expressed in this episode about what he's doing in London is likely to be the main Ted story this season, that he's going to spend the next 12 episodes working out if he's in the right place or if he should be back home. Although it does seem like Michelle is moving on with her life, and if she's introduced this Jake guy to Henry, then she must be fairly serious with him. Despite the fact we've never met Jake, I already hate him. I thought Rebecca's character underwent a bit of a realignment in this episode. Last season we spent a lot of time focused on her love life, and she didn't seem too concerned about the club. With Rupert now at West Ham, she's now fully focused on helping AFC Richmond to succeed, which is something we've not seen from her before. I like this change, but we also saw a more harder, meaner side of Rebecca in this episode when she tried to talk Ted into going out on the attack. I suppose Keely has always softened Rebecca's hard edges, and now she's not around as much. Maybe that's part of why we're seeing a harder side of Rebecca. I noticed she was back to calling Ted Coach Lasso at times in this episode too, which might suggest things are a bit more prickly between them. Watching Nate settling in at West Ham is fascinating. He's still a nasty piece of work. In fact, he seems like he's got even worse now he's been given the top job at a club. At Richmond, he would get a frown from Beard or Ted if he swore at a player from the touchline or made a nasty comment, but that behaviour seems to be encouraged at West Ham. I think being mean to people can get results in the short term, but Nate will struggle to get his team to do what he wants if he's horrible to them all the time, as they'll feel no loyalty towards him. Why do you want to play for someone if they're basically bullying you? It looked to me like Nate was close to having a panic attack in his press conference. If I read it correctly, he managed to pull it around by making himself angry and spitting on the floor, which is entirely consistent with how he's pulled off his best performances in the past. In Season 2, he spat just before he saved the FA Cup quarter-final game against Spurs, and when he needed to build up his confidence to ask for a table upgrade at the Greek restaurant. So the spitting thing is his way of drawing on his self-loathing to make himself confident. At the end of last season, we found out that Nate felt let down by Ted, and he looked up to him like a father figure. Now it seems like he's latched onto Rupert as his surrogate dad. This may work for him, but I'm not sure I'd want to rely on someone as sneaky and nasty as Rupert. It's all smiles and free cars at the moment, but if results aren't what they should be, Nate will quickly find himself on the other side of Rupert. We know from the things Rebecca has said that he's got a very unpleasant side, and I suspect Nate will see this before the end of the season. I felt like we as the audience were being treated a bit like Phoebe, as we sat down and had Roy and Keely's breakup explained to us. Phoebe took it much better than me too. She's far more resilient. Actually, in all seriousness, I did think they might have split up in the in-between time between the seasons. In a way, this may be the best thing for their relationship, as I think they're still right for each other, but they need time apart to work that out. That's my prediction anyway. As I mentioned in my recap, I have a few concerns about Keely's new business. I think she may have got into bed with a cutthroat venture capital company, who only set her up in the company to exploit her name and reputation as a rising star in business. The difference between Keely and her colleagues seems so huge, I just can't see things working out for her in that company. My favourite line in this episode came from Keely's CFO, Barbara, when she said, "Flowers of two things, Miss Jones, dead people and dead marriages." It's a funny line, but it also tells us everything we need to know about this woman. She's not sentimental, and she hasn't got any patience with Keely by the sounds of it. She was barely on screen for 30 seconds, but with just a few lines, she made me laugh and set herself up as a new antagonist for this season. I'm looking forward to seeing more of her already. The belief post that Nate tore in half in the Season 2 finale was taped up and back on the changing room wall for this episode. I like that Ted chose to repair the original rather than make a new one. The training ground has been renamed the Earl Greyhound Training Facility, after the mascot that died at the start of Season 2, when it collided with Danny Rojas' penalty. Rebecca mentioned how Left Eye from TLC burned her boyfriend's trainers and then burned down the house. I'd never heard of this story before, but when I looked it up, it's all true. She was angry that he'd gone out and bought a load of new trainers without getting her any, so she set fire to them and the whole house ended up burning down. It sounded like a horribly abusive relationship, and they both smashed up each other's car with a vacuum cleaner pipe while the house was burning down. I think she got off fairly lightly for burning down the house. She avoided jail and she was sentenced to live in a halfway house, got 5 years probation and a $10,000 fine. And, most incredibly, the couple didn't split up after the fire. They stayed together for years afterwards. I can't believe that they stayed together after all of that, but I bet her boyfriend remembered to buy her some trainers the next time he went shopping. Rupert mentioned that he went to St. Bart's with the Sacklers. He's referring to the notorious family that owns Purdue Pharma, a company that are widely thought to have contributed to the opioid epidemic, so much so that they're subject to a TV drama called Dopesick, a TV documentary called All the Beauty and the Bloodshed, and a book called Empire of Pain by Patrick Rodden O'Keefe. I've read the book, and I'd highly recommend it if you enjoy stories about badly behaved rich people. Kenneth the bus driver says he's going to smoke toad venom. I didn't know that was a thing, but apparently the venom from the Sonoran desert toad or the Colorado river toad contains DMT, which is a hallucinogen, and it's a popular way for people to get high, and is even used as a very alternative type of medicine. It's described as providing a window into the sacred, and can lead to a better understanding of one's place in the universe. However, I wouldn't recommend it, as it's a bit risky for people to take, but more worryingly, apparently the trend for getting high on toad venom means that these toads are getting harassed towards extinction. Don't be a toad botherer. Roy talks to Beard about the film he's watching his recommendation called The Hosue, which is a Gene Hackman movie about a small-time basketball team that makes it to the state championships. There were several references to the film in last season's Man City episode, with Richmond's trip to Wembley echoing the team in the movie's trip to the state championships. To answer Emma's question, hosue means someone from Indiana, so the film's called Hosue because it's about a small-town basketball team in Indiana. Beard and Roy informed Ted that 4-4-2 was invented by a Russian, and they were right. It was a man called Viktor Maslov, who used the formation as a way of winning the midfield battle at a time when most teams played a 4-2-4 system. By dropping his wingers back into midfield, he overwhelmed the opposition and had a numerical advantage there. He was also one of the first to implement a pressing style, which meant everyone on the pitch put pressure on the opposition when they had the ball, which was innovative at the time, back in the 1950s. Another recent Premier League team to use 4-4-2 to their advantage was Burnley under Sean Dyche, who managed to punch above their weight for many seasons by using a disciplined and energetic 4-4-2 tactic, which wasn't pretty, but it got them the results they needed to stay up for many seasons. One thing that I found a little strange in this episode was that Nate was delivering training to his West Ham players in the stadium rather than a proper training facility. In the real world, West Ham have a training ground that's about half an hour's drive away from the stadium. It's not unheard of for teams to occasionally train in their stadiums for a change, but I suspect in this case the producers were trying to make the most of West Ham's impressive-looking home ground as a filming location. They play at the London Stadium, which was previously the Olympic Stadium for the 2012 Olympic Games. I went to watch Huddersfield Town play West Ham at the stadium a few years ago. It's a pretty dreadful experience for fans, because most of the seats are miles away from the pitch because it's a converted athletic stadium, which makes it feel a bit soulless. As a piece of engineering, however, it's really impressive. It's worth pointing out the irony, too, of Nate making his players train on the pitch, when the first time we ever saw him was him shouting at Beard and Ted for walking on AFC Richmond's pitch. Keely says to Rebecca that she should let Ted be Ted, and then later she says she should let Rupert be Rupert when they're talking in her office. This phrasing is borrowed from the TV show The West Wing, where they have an episode called Let Bartlett Be Bartlett, which is about allowing the president to be himself and play to his strengths. I think this episode has done a good job of helping us to understand roughly what the season is going to be about, so I expect we'll see more of Nate settling in at West Ham, Keely trying to get to grips with her new business, Ted guiding his team through the start of the Premier League season while he searched for his own sense of purpose, and Rebecca trying to get one over Rupert. One way AFC Richmond want to get an edge is to bring in new players, so there's potential we might see some new characters soon. Ted was reluctant to unsettle the balance he has in the changing room, but everyone else seemed keen to bring in fresh blood, so I suspect we'll see some activity in the transfer market. One thing we didn't see in this episode were any hints about Rebecca and Sam's love affair that ended last season, but may spark up again at some point. It's possible that it may just be forgotten about now, and that they'll pursue new storylines, but I suspect those feelings are still bubbling away with those characters. Thank you for watching my recap and review of Episode 1 of Season 3 of Ted Lasso. I'll be uploading my videos for Season 3 shortly after each episode airs, so please subscribe to make sure you don't miss them. Goodbye.